Jazz Reads, and today I'll be bringing you along on a journey about the novel The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Today I'm by myself with my coffee from 33 Coffee House, our sponsor of today. Come get your coffee and or treat from our local and loving coffee house. Away from the coffee, our novel The Handmaid's Tale is a book based on a dystopian society where our main character Offred is ripped away from her rights and thrown into a whole new world, a life even. Offred experiences manipulation and scarred from her theocratic society multiple times in many different ways. And today we're going to look at this book and compare it to real-life events like the Third Reich and the current state of the Catholic Church. We will separate today's podcast into 3 different sections. First section being a dystopian of World War II, second being the Gilead versus the Third Reich, and the third and last section being the blind dystopians in the Catholic Church. In the Second World War, Jewish people are stripped from their rights and freedom and were put out into concentration camps to be executed. This was an act done by Nazi Germany, influenced by Adolf Hitler. For starter, the Jews were given a yellow star to identify that they were Jewish out of a group of people. The Jews were then sent out to the camps and categorized into men that are fit to work and women and children who were unfortunately executed on the spot. Though many tried to escape the camps, there weren't many escapees. There was still much rebellion that was shown from the Jewish prisoners, but the prisoners that attempted to escape or showed rebellious acts were spared no further and executed on the spot by either firearm or put to the gas chambers. SS guards were Nazi soldiers that guarded these camps. At the end of the war, there was an estimated 8,000 plus soldiers that worked at the camps. These camps showed no mercy to the prisoners at the end and were highly unethical. Probably a good reason why at the end of the war, they tried their absolute best of hiding all evidence and even going as far as denying that they ever happened. A survivor of these camps is novel writer Elie Wiesel, and his book Night is an important part of history to see the point of view of someone firsthand taking on the challenges of Camp Auschwitz. Elie was just a young boy when him and his family were taken by SS officers and stripped of their rights and freedom and were sentenced to Camp Auschwitz by force. In the novel Night, Elie is shown being put in inhuman-like scenarios where he is starved, robbed of warmth, dehydrated, and forced to do tasks that he doesn't want to do. This goes to show just how much these prisoners were dehumanized. Elie, like all prisoners, were used to a point where they could no longer work in these harsh conditions, so they were literally worked to death. Elie was also experimented on by SS doctors who would experiment them with biological and chemical weapons, where this information would later be used in the aid of killing the mass of the Jewish people. Elie was separated from his mother and sister at first and left only with his dad. His mom and sister were instantly put to gas chambers and put to death without any labor. He and his father were sent to the same subcamp and worked together. His dad later dies whilst the camp was moving the prisoners from one camp to another in the freezing winter cold whilst Elie was asleep. Elie was then left alone with only the prisoners. Even though Elie didn't talk to many of these prisoners himself, his connection with his dad allowed him to interact with them. Elie at first is too shocked to make connections about what happened to the rest of his family, but later makes remarks about his past life before everything changed. These thoughts consisted of his mother and siblings passing and wanting to take his own life and escape. But how did this all come about? Well, when the Second World War was implemented, the birth of the Third Reich was given. The Third Reich is a regime that the Nazi Party made to manipulate their society. This allowed Nazi Germany to use religion as a front for tyranny. The Third Reich objectives, implemented in 1933, was the objective of fusing both German ideologies and Christianity whilst blaming it on the Jewish descent. If in the novel Twisted Cross, the German Christian movement in the Third Reich, by Doris Bergen, it states, and I quote, "I was struck by what seemed contorted efforts to fuse Christianity with Germanness and purge it of Jewish influence. The church in Germany was taken over by the Third Reich and changed the influence of the church to better fit their standards. They did this by taking words out of texts and using biblical verses that would only help fit their ideology that matches theirs. This means that the church eliminated Jewish people entirely from attending to create the purity in their new shaped society by the Third Reich. Purity in this sense was society without Jewish people." That's all for our first section, the dystopia of the Second World War. Now we're going to transition over to our next section, Gilead versus the Third Reich, where we will talk about the comparison to Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale and the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. is very clear to see that there's many similarities in the concept of the book and the Nazi regime. For starters, the classification of handmaids, aunts, Marthas, and slaves is a connection most noticeably with the yellow stars and categorization of men, women, and children in the camps. The requirement of prisoners are also very similar in the idea that if you cannot perform your task, you will be punished. In the camps, it is seen of lack of work, but in the handmaids are punished if they can no longer reproduce. Hence the quote on page 68, "It's true, and I don't ask why, because I know. Give me children, or else I die." Guards are also very similar to the fact that they are simply pawns for the higher power organizations they work for. The target groups aren't at war with the guards, but who they serve. Rebelling is shown in both groups, with prisoners of the camps showing in more physical fighting back, whilst in the Handmaid tale, they see Offred shows her rebellious mindset with quotes like that on page 241, "I could burn the house down. Such a fine thought. It makes me shiver, and escape, quick and narrow." When comparing both the point of views of Offred and Ellie, we see the characters show very similar characteristics when having to deal with their corrupt society. Both members have lost freedom and rights. Separation is a big topic when talking about these two, as characters suffered being separated from loved ones. I don't know about you, but if I lost either of my parents, I know I'd be overwhelmed with fear and depression. And I know many of you would feel the same. Ellie lost his entire family and his life with separation. Offred also lost her entire life and being robbed of her daughter and husband and being used as a handmaid. This is evident on page 204 when Offred states, "When I go back to the house, nobody was there. Luke was still at work, my daughter was at school." It's important to see this concept to envision it for yourself. Do you really want to see a world where you're strapped from your home and family? It is a clear sign that we need to do whatever it is in our power to avoid a world like this. But what about comparing the Nazi regime to Gilead toe-to-toe? It is very clear to see that two organizations use many ways to control their society. Biblical manipulation is used on both ends to allow for a religion to take over for a front of tyranny. They use the Bible as a wise and trustworthy source and turn its ideologies to fit that of their own. A quote used again and again in The Handmaid's Tale shows itself on page 21, "Blessed be the fruit." The quote means to be fruitful, also meaning to reproduce, which is the purpose of the handmaids. Gilead uses this quote from the Bible to push their ideology of creating a pure handmaid-birthed society. It's significant to see just how easy it is for an organization to take something as trustworthy as, aka the Bible, and turn it into something of their own. Another example of just how negative and manipulative a society like this can be for us. Margaret Atwood herself talks about this subject, as many readers questioned if The Handmaid's Tale is anti-religion. She states, and I quote, "So the book is not anti-religion, it's against the use of religion as a front for tyranny, which is a different thing altogether." And she is right. Gilead in the book, just as the Third Reich did, allowed religion to lose all of its meaning when being manipulated with. Instead, the idea of religion is being used by a corrupt organization for their own power, a front for tyranny, as Margaret would put it. A touchy subject that isn't talked about in The Handmaid's Tale, but is noticeable, is the Puritan society they've developed. The book doesn't talk about this subject much, as the narrator, Offred, is a Puritan herself, and the subject doesn't affect her in the slightest. The idea of a pure society is an excuse for racism and not wanting certain ethnicities within their society. The Nazi regime shows to do the same thing with the main intention of eliminating the Jewish people. This hidden conflict in the book is important to talk about for the same reasons of many other problems we have explored. The concept of excluding other races is yet another sign of loss of freedom. This common theme that shows up again and again will be discussed later in today's episode. Propaganda is a very commonly used technique for convincing a great society of something good and or bad. Unfortunately, corrupt propaganda is used both in Gilead and the Nazi regime to hide information, spread false news, and tamper with information. In Gilead, we see this evident when Offred watches the TV and sees the news about the front lines of the war. The front lines of the soldiers were called angels to enact the idea that they were fighting for the right side. On page 26, it states, "This is the heart of Gilead, where the war cannot intrude except on television." This is something we can relate to the real world with fake news and how news articles could be deceiving and false when being written by the beliefs of another person and or organization. Denial is the final connection between the Third Reich and Gilead, as both organizations attempted to deny all events that took place after the organizations came to a halt. Nazi regime burnt and destroyed many camps of all evidence of anything before the camps were overthrown and invaded by Axis powers. Gilead is said to do the same thing in the Talk of the Historical Notes section of our novel. In the notes, on page 349, it states, "The surviving records of the time are spotty, as the Gilead regime is in the habit of wiping its own computers and destroying printouts after various purges and internal upheavals, but some printouts remain." This is important to acknowledge as the reader to make the realization that Gilead knew exactly what they were doing was wrong. Same with the Nazi regime, as if they weren't in the wrong, what is the purpose of hiding all the evidence have in store for them? This reminds me of a famous quote from Winston Churchill: "Those who do not learn history and those who do learn history are doomed to repeat it." This quote we will later talk about in the next section of our episode. Wrapping up this section, we will now take a short commercial break from 33 Coffee House. Come down to 33 Coffee House and have a warm coffee and or treat to have a quiet, relaxing space to study, read, or even a friendly conversation with a neighbor. Sunday and Saturdays, come in for a coffee and listen to a local jazz band play relaxing and calming music at 12 to 3 p.m. 33 Coffee House, your favorite and friendly local coffee house. Our next section, Blind Dystopias in the Catholic Church, is a current ongoing problem we see evolving today with corrupt organizations taking its place. The current dilemma in the church is the concept that God can't choose a CEO of the church. So where is all this money power going? In the article from CBC News written by Neil MacDonald, he states, "But of course, there's no company's warranty guarantees everlasting life, and no company maintains that its CEO is chosen by God. This can noticeably go very wrong with such a wide following and high money stake organization. It's bound to have its flaws, as money can't magically benefit God, who is all-empowering." And so, with time, many problems evolved. These problems evolved around sexual assault cases appearing between priests of the church and the children of the families that attend to the church. There have been roughly 1,000 cases of sexual abuse in Pennsylvania over several decades, with more than 300 predators. With the evidence that has been shown in the court for what these priests did to the kids, RICO, the racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organization, is a group of trained investigators to bring down the corrupt organizations like that of the current state of the church, was called in to deal with the situation at hand. These acts done to the kids were horrifying, so to put in simple terms, the priests would make the kids partake in a religious activity whilst also forced to partake in sexual acts. These acts are still taking place today, in new cases sprouting with time and time again. The Pope, also the CEO of the church, has been given weak apologies and weak promises to fix these ongoing problems, but with no act to actually resolve anything. Instead, the Pope denies some cases and gives RICO and other investigators no access to the records they have on hand. If the Pope really has nothing to hide, like he claims he does, then why does it hurt so much to hand over the documentations they've racked up over the years? This ongoing problem shows many similarities between the other regimes we talked about in the last section, Gilead versus the Third Reich. The church goes to show the similarity characteristics with their use of the Bible for their own gain, sexual assault cases, and the denying of events taking place. The Bible is used to extort money for the church, which is once again questioned where the money is actually going. Is this truly going back to the people that support the church? And what about the sexual assault cases? Why is there similarity with sexual abuse going on with handmaids and the children of following of the church? These two subjects lead the listeners to question where these organizations actually give back to the community instead of taking power for themselves. This presents these organizations rendered as selfish. Most importantly, we must look at the ongoing pattern with denial of these conflicts and how hiding evidence shows guilt, plus that they know they have been doing something wrong the whole time. Just like the two regimes, the Catholic Church refuses to give up information and documentation. They are able to do this as the church has great amount of power and money. That is all for this section, but we are not done just yet. We have to talk about the most important part of the episode, which is the lesson we have at hand. And to see this problem, we must look at the questions, What does this teach us? What can we do to avoid this scenario? And what are we currently doing to avoid a dystopian world? Now, what does looking at the Gilead regime do when we compare it to something of the past? The concentration camps in the Third Reich, and a problem with the current state of the Catholic Church. First, we see that these types of organizations show a pattern of the greater society having freedoms stripped away and the rights stripped away from them. The reason we acknowledge this is to see the problems that could evolve in our current real world that we live in today. The readers must understand the problem at hand and acknowledge that we need to avoid this quote-unquote solution as much as possible to maintain our freedom status. These organizations will use us for their own power, leaving us with little to no power to fight back and rebel. Now, since we've established the problem at hand, what can we do to avoid this scenario? The first thing to act on is to make sure the greater society all agrees that whatever the organization that's affecting them is in the wrong before they completely take over. This consists of them using the power that they have beforehand, the power of freedom, and making a difference by not supporting them by any means, and also looking for ways to take their power away from them. The second, and in my opinion the strongest of the two, is to educate all future generations about dystopias and what really happened when they did take place. This allows the student to look over the world around them, a world filled with freedom, and look back to what used to be, for example the Third Reich, to compare the two worlds and understand that their life is much better. Acknowledging that life is better will help them want to avoid this kind of world of dystopian world, and so the greater population will do whatever it is in their means to stop a situation like this from taking place. And with hopes of education works, that the student later becomes the teacher and educates that future generation of the wrongs of these worlds, and so that the cycle repeats itself. So what are we doing now, you may ask? Well, we're doing exactly that. We have The Handmaid's Tale and the Nazi regime World War II in our education curriculum to teach kids the wrongs of a dystopian world, so that they can later teach their kids someday the same. This finally brings us back to our famous quote from Winston Churchill: "Those who do not learn history and those who do learn history are doomed to repeat it." In summary, this quote being our lesson means to educate history so we do not repeat our mistakes. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsor, 33 Coffee House. Alongside thanking you for your listening, it really supports the podcast with your attention and positive feedback. This is Jasmine from Jazz Reads, signing off and telling you to stay jazzy.